another 20 seconds or so here. Guess we're recording. Welcome to the Computer Security Seminar from Purdue University. Today's speaker is Professor William Winsborough from George Mason University, and he will talk on attribute-based access control. William.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the area of my research is policy-based security and privacy for distributed systems. In particular, I'm interested in situations where we have decentralized authority and each principal in the system has the opportunity to contribute some policy statements that together compose to form the or define the behavior of the system as a whole. So today I'll be talking about some work that I've been doing for the last several years in developing flexible and scalable access control for decentralized and collaborative environments as well as open systems like the internet. So the approach that we take to making authorization decisions is to base them on attributes of the resource requester, such as rights that they have to access specific resources or roles that they occupy in their home organizations, qualifiers that they might have like degrees or other characteristics like their age or nationality. And credentials are then used to establish someone's authorizations offline. These credentials consist of signed policy statements about the attributes of specific individuals' principles identified in the credentials, or else they can also contain rules for deriving attributes. What I'll talk about in today's lecture is three things. First, I'll introduce an authorization policy language that supports collaboration in decentralized and open systems. And then I'll talk about analysis techniques that we've developed for understanding and managing how policy delegates authority among various principles in the system. And then finally, I'll talk about the problem that because the credentials may have sensitive information in them, they themselves may have to be the subject of access control. So we'll begin with policy language design. And this is work that I did with Ninghui Li and John Mitchell, which was published in the 2002 Oakland conference. I'll talk about the requirements for a language, give a couple of examples, introduce the syntax and semantics. So first and foremost, what we want from a attribute-based authorization language is the ability to decentralize the authority to define attributes. Basically, we want to have the opportunity for lots of different people to make claims about principles within the system, and then we'll utilize policy and credentials from many sources in making authorization decisions. So policies, or one person may delegate authority to another for the purposes of controlling some resource, and this could be delegation to a specific principle by name, but we'd also like to be able to support delegation to principles that satisfy certain attributes. So this is not by name, but by attribute. We want to be able to support the inference of attributes from one or more other attributes, like when we would derive access rights based on roles or other characteristics. We'd also like to support parameterization so that an age attribute could actually have a numeric field in it and say, what the age value is. We'd like to be able to support thresholds, which is basically a kind of voting, and separation of duties, which is a technique that can be used to reduce or make fraud more difficult to commit. So the language that we'll be working with for this talk is called RT, for role-based trust management. RT is actually a family of policy languages, the simplest member of which, RT0, satisfies all the requirements on the previous slide except for the three shown here. It doesn't support parameterization, thresholds, or separation of duties. Those features are supported by other members of the RT family, but we won't talk about them in today's talk. So here are 4 example RT0 credentials. The first one is issued by EPUB, an electronic publishing house, which says that students at State U are entitled to a student discount. So EPUB is a principal that has a key that he can use for the purpose of signing this statement, turning it into a credential then that can be verified offline. And the credential will also contain the public key of State U, which can be used then to check the signatures on the second and third credentials, in which State U says that somebody's a student if the university registrar says that they're registered for either a part-time or a full-time load. Down here in the last credential, the registrar says that Alice is registered for a part-time load, so that's effectively her student ID, and it can be combined with the other 3, the other red credentials here to prove that Alice is authorized for EPUB student discount. So Alice could present these credentials and obtain the discount without the authorizer ever having heard of State U or the U registrar or knowing their public keys ahead of time. Now, in the example I just gave, delegation is made to a particular individual, an individual university, State U. But in general, you might like to be able to support delegation to any university. So EPUB would like to be able to accept the student IDs of students from arbitrary universities. Now, how would you do that? You know, you could put in your policy every single university and say that their students are authorized. But this presents many problems, not the least of which is maintenance, but maybe the biggest is that EPUB is probably not an authority on what's a real university. You know, does a mechanics school or a beautician school or something like that qualify? Well, the authorities on what's a real university are accrediting agencies, or accrediting boards, excuse me. So in the second credential, EPUB delegates to FAB, a fictitious accrediting board, saying that anybody that's FAB accredited is considered to be a university by EPUB. And since State U has a credential that says that he's accredited, all right, here we go. Right here, EPUB.university can include people like State U. So if Alice shows using credentials that we saw already that she is a State U student, then she would be entitled to the student discount. So the basic structure in RT is a role which has the form A.R, in which A is a principal and R is a role name. There are 4 different kinds of statements that A can issue in order to define who's actually in his role, A.R. The first one, A.R includes D, just says that the principal D is a member. The second one, A delegates some authority to B. He's saying anybody that is in B's B.R1 role is in A.R. So A.R contains B.R1 as a subset. The third form of statement says that A.R includes B.R2 for all B in A.R1. So B would be like the university in our previous example. And then the fourth statement says that A.R includes anybody that's in both A1.R1 and A2.R2. So that's basically a form of conjunction. Now, the first 3 statements together give rise to a language that's equivalent to SUDSI, simple distributed security infrastructure, a language that was proposed in, I think it's 1996, and later sort of combined with spooky, simple public key infrastructure. But I mention this because a fair amount of work has been done on how to provide a semantics for SUDSI. We'll actually take a different approach to providing the semantics for RT, and I'll, in my next slide, give you some explanation as to why that is. But in this slide, I'll briefly show you the construction of that semantics. It's based on constructing a logic program, in fact, a restricted logic program called a data log program. And the way that it works is that for each statement in the policy, you get one clause in the data log program. So the first form of statement, A.R includes D, gets translated into the simplest form of clause often called a fact, in which the M is the membership predicate, and this just says that D is included in A.R. The second form, in which A.R includes B.R1, is translated into something that just uses the membership predicate to say almost exactly the same thing. So this little symbol right here is read if, and this says that X is in A.R if X is in B.R1. That captures the intuition that I think you'll agree is natural. In the third form, we want to say that, well, it's just translated into X is in A.R if there exists a Y in A.R1 such that X is in Y.R2. And finally, intersection just turns into conjunction. So now the semantics is defined in terms of logical entailment. So if you have D, a member of A.R in all models of the program, then the semantic says that D is in the role A.R. So one of the neat things about using logic programming to construct the semantics is that it makes the complexity results really easy. Data log has been studied a great deal, and it can be evaluated in a time that's a small polynomial. Other semantic foundations don't support features that we really want, like, for instance, even intersection. So the string rewriting and pushdown systems are approaches that have been used for providing or evaluation of SUDSI, and neither one of them is really suitable in a context where you've got intersection. Moreover, using the logic programming approach enables one to easily extend the language to incorporate those extra features like parameters, thresholds, and separation of duty. So at this point, I'd like to switch gears from talking about the basic language and tell you a little bit about security analysis. So the goal here is the understanding and management of these distributed authorization policies. The reason is that authors of policy statements need assistance in understanding the global impact of statements that they add or revoke. Indeed, others may also need assistance in understanding the situation with a policy. They need to understand who could get access to what and who could be denied based on the fact that the policy may actually evolve in a situation where not all, no given entity controls the entire policy, and hence is going to evolve beyond the control of any one entity. So I'm particularly proud about this work, in part because it's going to be published in the Journal of the ACM. And again, my co-authors are Ninghui Li and John Mitchell. in this part of the talk, I'll give you some background on the security analysis problem. I'll describe the abstract case of security analysis for trust management, and then make it concrete for the language RT. Then I'll discuss a couple of usage scenarios and the complexity results that we obtained. So, security analysis actually has a long history of study. Going back 30 years, a subproblem called safety analysis has been studied, and in that work, the access control model was based on an access control matrix. So the idea with an access control matrix is that rows correspond to subjects, columns correspond to objects, and the cells give you the access rights that that the subject has with respect to that object. Now, this forms the state of a state machine whose transitions correspond to the execution of commands of the form shown here. A command tests to see whether several rights are in given access cells, and then, if so, executes a sequence of operations that can enter new rights into cells, remove rights from cells, add or delete columns or rows. And now, in this model, a system such as this is deemed to be safe if there's no sequence of commands that gives a given right A to a particular subject S on object O, where A, S, and O are all given. And Harrison, Rousseau, and Ullman showed in 1976 that determining whether a system such as this is safe is actually an undecidable problem. So there was subsequently a fair amount of work trying to figure out alternative systems that would give a decidability. And it's very interesting, I think, that in the trust management context, what we found is that the analogous problem is not only decidable, but it's decidable in polynomial time. So let's take a look at what the analogous problem is in trust management systems. Basically, evolution of the system, or transitions, now corresponds to the fact that an individual doesn't control the entire policy state, and other parts of the policy state can be changed beyond his control, or in an uncontrolled way. And to capture this notion of uncontrolled changes, we introduce the idea of a restriction rule R, which says how a policy state P can evolve into another policy state P prime. And given this framework, we can articulate two different forms of analysis problem. An existential analysis problem asks whether there exists a P prime reachable from P in which a certain query holds from P prime. And a universal analysis problem asks whether in all policy states reachable from P, the query holds. So let me give you a few examples of the kinds of things that you can phrase this way. Can Alice ever get access to the database? This is a simple safety question because basically you don't want Alice to have access and you're worried about it. Will Bob always have access to the database? Now, presumably, Bob is somebody that needs to have access. You want them to have access, and you're worried about the resources availability to Bob. We can also articulate other things like bounded safety. Can anyone besides you and me ever get access? Or liveness. Will there always be somebody that has access? Or mutual exclusion. Can anyone ever be both a buyer and an accountant? Now, all of the ones that I've listed so far have the characteristic that they compare the membership of a role to a constant set of principles. In the last two, we actually will compare two different classes or roles. So we can say, for instance, will all managers always have access? So we're comparing managers and those that have access. And in the very last one, can anyone who is not an employee ever get access? So these have respectively the flavor of availability and safety. So to make the problem concrete, we study it in RT0. And policy states are given by RT0 policies. The restriction rule that I talked about, which defines how policies can evolve in an uncontrolled way, is given by two sets. G, which is a set of roles that whose definitions are assumed not to grow during the course of uncontrolled evolution, and shrink-restricted sets S, which the analysis assumes will not have their statements removed or their definitions removed from the state. There are going to be three different forms of queries: membership, boundedness, and containment. You'll notice that membership and boundedness, basically, they compare a given role, A.R, to a specific set of given principles, D1 through Dn. So on the left, we ask whether A.R, I'm sorry, on the first one, we ask whether A.R contains D1 through Dn as a subset. And in the other case, we ask whether A.R is bounded by the set D1 through Dn. Now, the third is actually strictly more general. It asks whether the role x.u contains A.R as a subset, and it can be used to capture membership and boundedness queries, but we distinguish it we distinguish the first two cases because they can actually be solved in polynomial time, as we'll see. So let me just work a couple of examples for you quickly. The idea here, I'm going to give you a policy and a restriction rule, and then we'll pose a couple of queries and see how it works. The idea here is that the system administrator, SA, has a resource, and he grants access to the resource to everybody that HR says is a manager, and to everybody that a manager says should have access, provided that person is an employee. HR says you're an employee if you're a manager or a programmer. Alice is a manager. Bob and Carl are programmers. And Alice says that Bob should have access. So currently, Bob does have access. And then G and S define the restriction rule, and we'll play with them in a minute. The first example asks a simple safety query. Is it possible that Eve should gain access to the resource? And the answer to this is yes, because the first statement up there says that any manager has access, and we can actually, HR can add a statement defining HR.manager at any time in an uncontrolled way. So the analysis has to take that into consideration. And the reason that we know it can add it in an uncontrolled way is that HR.manager is not included in G. The second query asks a simple availability question. Is it necessary that Alice has access? Will she always have access? And the answer to that is, again, yes, because of the two statements shown in red here give Alice access now, and the fact that they both define shrink-restricted roles means that those clauses or those statements won't go away in the future. So the third example illustrates containment, the most powerful form. It asks whether those who can get access are always going to be employees. And the answer to this turns out to be yes. Basically, there's no way to get access besides by these first two rules. That's because SA access is growth restricted, so we won't get any more statements defining it. If you gain access by using the second rule, you're clearly an employee because of this intersection. And if you gain it by the first, then you're a manager, and by the third statement, you are therefore an employee, and that employee definition is not going to go away because this is shrink restricted. So that's going to remain the case. So let me give you an idea of how this can be used. I mean, this is one of many possibilities. An organization has many principals to whom it entrusts the preservation of the policy state, but it has some ideas of sanity checks for what a good policy ought to do. You know, bad guys shouldn't get access, and key guys should have access to critical resources, that kind of thing. So what the organization does is he formalizes these as analysis problems together with acceptable answers, either yes or no, and then trusts the principals in his organization to run the analysis before they actually make any policy changes, and only commit the changes if they will preserve the requirements. So the evaluation of membership and boundedness queries can be done efficiently by using two non-standard logic programming semantics for program P. And I won't go into them here. Containment queries, on the other hand, their complexity, or the complexity of the analysis problem, depends on the sublanguage. So if we call this basic RT, it contains only facts and simple delegations. RT with linking, RT with intersection, and RT with both is just all of RT0. And here are the results. It turns out that there are polynomial algorithms for basic RT. And then if you add linking, the complexity jumps up to p-space complete. If you add intersection, it becomes co-NP complete. And if you add both, we don't have a lower bound, but we know it's in co-non-deterministic exponential time. Okay, so at this point, I want to switch gears and talk about the fact that when using credentials in order to gain authorization in an open system, you may not wish to trust the recipient of these credentials with everything you've got, because the credentials themselves may be sensitive. We want a way to establish trust between strangers that somehow preserves the privacy requirements on the sensitive attributes and shares them only with authorized entities. So the approach that we take is really somewhat simplistic, but it seems to work quite well in most cases. Credentials are treated as protected resources. So access control policies are established for them just like they are for other protected resources. And then automated trust negotiation is our technique that consists of a bilateral credential exchange in which the negotiators seek to establish mutual trust incrementally. Now, the simplest strategy that you can use for this is called the eager strategy. In it, negotiators take turns sending all the unlocked credentials. So negotiator 1 sends all the credentials that he basically considers public information. Then negotiator 2 replies with all of his public credentials plus any that have been unlocked by negotiators 1 public credentials. These may unlock additional credentials from negotiator 1 and so on until either the access control policy associated with the resource is satisfied and the negotiation succeeds, or else no further credentials can be exchanged, in which case the negotiation fails. The eager strategy was introduced by us in this paper here, which appeared at the DARPA Information Survivability Conference and Exposition in the year 2000. It's not a really prestigious venue, but I'm pleased to report that it's had 34 citations listed in CiteSeer at this point. So I think that a lot of people have been interested in the trust negotiation stuff. there are several results in the paper about the eager strategy. First of all, it's complete in the sense that it'll find a negotiation whenever a sequence of disclosures exists that is safe. It's efficient in the sense that the number of rounds is at most linear in the number of credentials. And it's safe in a way that I'd like to basically spend the rest of the talk discussing. So what's the intuition? We don't want to share credential content with people that aren't authorized for it. But it turns out that the original notion of correctness or safety for automated trust negotiation doesn't really achieve this goal of protecting sensitive credentials. Now, Ninghui and I, in the year 2000, proposed a method that I'll show you that sought to protect attributes better, but we still didn't have a formal definition of what safety ought to mean. And then this year in the Oakland conference, we presented a formal statement of what of what safety should require. And that's actually going to be the crux of this part of the talk. And then I'll also mention a recent journal submission in which we show that a practical negotiation strategy based on RT satisfies the requirement. And so we might conjecture that the requirement is achievable. But there have been a lot of negotiation strategies proposed that don't satisfy it. And here are some of those, including one that I introduced myself back in 2000. What all of these have in common is that they establish access control policies that are used to control the disclosure of credentials in the sense of handing over the credential. And the way that the reason that they ran into troubles where actually the eager strategy did not is that they seek to focus credential disclosures on credentials that are somehow relevant to the requested resource and satisfying its access control policy. And thus, policy content needs to flow in order to focus the content of the credential disclosures. And a couple of these pieces of work, the third and fourth, actually discuss the fact that the policies themselves may be sensitive, which I think is a very important and interesting point, but not one that I'll dwell on further here. They all used the original notion of safety for credential disclosures, which is unfortunately inadequate. It said that a credentials access control policy must be satisfied before the credential is disclosed. But it doesn't say exactly what disclosed means. And using any of the strategies on the previous slide, the negotiator's behavior actually reveals a great deal about his credentials, no matter who he's negotiating with, even if they're not authorized for the credential content. Let me show you what I mean. Here, Bob has a credential he received from the Internal Revenue Service that says he's got low income. Maybe he can use it online to get pro bono legal assistance or things of that nature. But he goes, and he considers it to be sensitive, so he establishes an access control policy for this credential that says he'll only share it with not-for-profits. He goes to a real estate agent, swampland.com, and requests some property listings, at which point Swampland initiates a trust negotiation with him saying, I'd like to see your low-income credential. Now, using any of those strategies, in effect what Bob does is to give a counter request saying, well, I'd like to see your not-for-profit credential. And the problem is, now Swampland knows that Bob has low income, because if Bob didn't, he'd behave like Alice, who also doesn't, and just basically fail or give no response to the request for the low income credential. So in the Policy 2000 paper, we sought to protect attributes by introducing what we call acknowledgement policies. So these are by contrast with access control policies, and they're associated with attributes rather than credentials. And that enables you to establish them whether or not you actually have the credential. So what an acknowledgement policy does is to authorize knowing whether or not the negotiator has the given attribute. I won't tell you whether I've got it unless you satisfy my ACK policy. During a negotiation, I can show you the ACK policy for my low-income credential without implying that I have it. That's because I could easily have established it without having it. And this work was published in the IEEE workshop on policy. So here, Alice may also consider her income to be sensitive information and establish an ACK policy for it that says she'll only share that with not-for-profits. And if she does so, then her behavior is exactly identical to that of Bob's. Now, detractors have argued that people that have nothing to hide won't bother to use acknowledgement policies, thereby casting suspicion on those that do use them. But there's a key observation here, which shows why, in fact, I think they're workable. Anyone wishing to protect any sensitive attribute whatsoever has to protect some attributes about which he has nothing to hide. Otherwise, the mere fact that he's protecting one attribute indicates he's got something to hide there, and you can tell maybe his attribute there isn't so favorable. And probably guess what it is for that matter. So in this context, if suitable acknowledgement policies were available, widely available for all attributes, the simplest approach would simply be to enforce them all. Okay? So our solution is, let's make them widely available and achieve that by making ACK policy design part of attribute vocabulary design. A reference to an attribute has to contain somehow a reference to the vocabulary that's used in the attribute to avoid name collisions. So if we include with the vocabulary an acknowledgement policy, then when you ask me for any attribute, even if I've never heard of it before, I can just go to that URL, retrieve the acknowledgement policy, and serve it to you. So in the Oakland paper, we formalized an intuitive safety requirement for protecting attributes. This is the paper, Safety and Automated Trust Negotiation. And I'd like to quickly run through the framework so that I can state the safety requirement for you. Basically, a negotiator is assumed to have a configuration G, which gives a principal K that he has control over, and a set of credentials that he owns, E. Plus, there's a table of policies and a mapping from attributes to their acknowledgement policies. What can adversaries do? Well, we model them as sets of principals and their credentials, so they may be able to collude. Multiple principals may be colluding. And what we assume an attacker can do is to issue an attack sequence consisting of a sequence of K messages. And the attack sequence can either be an active one, in which case the attacker is playing the role of a resource requester, or it can be a passive attack sequence, in which case he's playing the role of an access mediator or a resource provider. Now, not all attack sequences are feasible because the attack sequence is going to use credentials, and we need to include an assumption that says he doesn't forge credentials, that's not realistic. So we just say that an attack sequence is feasible for M if the messages can be efficiently computed by M. Now, what information is effectively hidden from an adversary? We assume that all he can see is the negotiation. So a given strategy, for a given strategy, two configurations, G and G prime, are indistinguishable using that strategy with M if for every feasible attack sequence, the response induced from G and G prime are the same. Okay, so that's how we formalize the idea that all the attacker can see is your negotiation interaction. What doesn't need to be hidden? Well, an attribute T is acknowledgeable to an attacker M or an adversary M if M possesses attributes that satisfy the acknowledgement policy of T, and releasable credentials are just those that define no unacknowledgeable attributes. So now I can articulate the safety requirement. We call it credential combination hiding. This is a property of strategies. A strategy is credential combination hiding safe if for every pair of configurations, G and G prime, where the acknowledgement policies agree, because acknowledgement policies have to be something that you see, and given any adversary M, if the credentials that are releasable to M using G's credentials are the same as those using G primes, then G and G prime have to be indistinguishable by M when you're using that strategy. Okay? Now, we came up with some alternative formulations to see whether it had to be this strong. We tried a couple of weaker formulations that didn't focus on the credentials but just on the attributes. And there was one that looked at hiding combinations of attributes and one that looked at just hiding individual attributes. But in the end, they all turned out to be inadequate for our purposes, which gives us some confidence that we've sort of hit the notion about right. It's probably not stronger than it needs to be. Now, we recently, after the Oakland conference, we submitted a journal version of the paper that it kind of included some of the policy workshop paper and added a new result which says that our safety result is satisfied by essentially the negotiation strategy that we introduced in the Policy 2000 paper. So that's the theorem. Our RT-based strategy is credential combination hiding safe, and we submitted that to TISIC. And the reason that that was kind of interesting and tricky is that RT is an inferential system. So if I want to protect A.R, I may actually have to protect B.R1 as well if we have A.R includes B.R1. So these inferences can be made by an adversary both in a forward direction and in a backward direction. So we had to come up with a kind of closure operation on the acknowledgement policies, which took care of that. So I'm at the end, and what I've told you about is three problems. First of all, providing a language for authorization policy to support collaboration in open systems. This is the RT language. Then techniques for understanding and managing policy. This is the security analysis work. And then finally, trust negotiation techniques and, in particular, requirements for protecting sensitive credential content. The work was funded by DARPA and by the NSF, and we have a medium-sized ITR that just started last year. This is something that Professor Lee and I are cooperating in, along with several others listed here. And one angle that I think is interesting for future work is based on the security policy management stuff. Basically, I'd like to have an assistant that could automatically generate proposals about how to guarantee security requirements are met. So you remember that I had this usage case where an organization could define a bunch of requirements and then entrust to the trusted collection of principals to preserve those requirements. Well, those principals might like a tool to help them do that. If they try to write some policy that turns out to violate the requirements, they'd like to know why and if it's possible to fix things up. And if not, why not? Another thing that's interesting here is insider threat assessment. So we've assumed that the trusted guys aren't going to change things, but suppose that they start making changes that they shouldn't. How much damage could they do to you? Can they compromise all your resources? We need to be able to assess one's exposure to individuals or colluding groups of insiders, and possibly to suggest ways of reducing one's exposure, for example, by introducing separation of duties. And then clearly we need heuristics for the intractable queries that we were talking about. So I think I'll leave it there. I'd like to know if anybody has any questions for me.
This seems to have a lot of things in common with the inference problem in multi-level secure databases. That was a pretty strong area of research maybe 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. Except that the security policy there, or the disclosure policy, was very different from what you're looking at. And I'm wondering, have you looked to see whether there's things other than policy negotiation where these models and approaches might be applicable in terms of other confidentiality situations?
I mean, I haven't found any. I've looked. Now, Ninghui, you've been looking at this too with me. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So I think there's certainly some similarities. This kind of correctness requirement for trust negotiation is very much related to information flow security. The definition turns out to be quite similar to definition of non-interference and non-divisibility. But I'm not sure how you can apply this to other areas.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me intuitively, it seems like there ought to be other areas where confidentiality is not absolute, mm-hmm. where this would provide a way to model, and I'm not sure what they are, but I just think it may have wider applicability than.
You're working on this language-based security, right? Mm-hmm. Integrated something in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually following the kind of work that Andrew Myers has been doing for several years. And the idea there is that you would like to be able to control not just somebody's access to information, but what they can do with the information after they get it. So but in that context, the main thing that I'm looking at applying from this work is the kind of principal hierarchies that are possible in the RT system rather than some aspect of the negotiation. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.